Hello everyone, my name is Leah Wilson and today I will be presenting my ethical dilemma presentation for CAUC 501. My presentation focuses on counselor self-disclosure in addiction counseling and how ethical decision-making models can help counselors navigate difficult situations professionally and ethically. This presentation is based on the video To Self-Disclose or Not by Pearson Education ND. The main issue in this scenario is whether a counselor should disclose their own recovery experience to a client with addiction. Throughout this presentation, I will apply the ACA Ethical Decision-Making Model, relevant ACA ethical standards, Virginia counseling regulations, and scholarly literature to determine the most ethical course of action. In this vignette, the client explains he has struggled to connect with previous counselors because he felt they did not truly understand addiction and recovery. During the session, the client directly asks the counselor if he has personal experience with addiction. The counselor considers disclosing his own recovery experience to strengthen rapport and build trust with the client. This creates an ethical dilemma because self-disclosure can either support the therapeutic relationship or potentially harm it if boundaries become unclear. Addiction counseling can make these situations especially difficult because clients often value shared experiences and may feel more comfortable with counselors who appear relatable. However, counselors must carefully evaluate whether self-disclosure is truly beneficial for the client or whether it unintentionally shifts focus onto the counselor. Apologies. The main ethical issue in this case is balancing rapport and authenticity while still maintaining professionalism, appropriate boundaries, and client-centered care. The primary ethical problem in this scenario is determining whether self-disclosure is appropriate within the counseling relationship. The counselor must decide whether sharing personal recovery experiences would benefit the client or potentially cause harm. Another major concern is maintaining professional boundaries. Although self-disclosure may increase trust, it can also blur the line between professional and personal interactions. There are also several secondary concerns in this situation. One concern is that the focus of therapy could unintentionally shift away from the client and onto the counselor. Another issue is that the client's beliefs about addiction and recovery may become influenced by the counselor's personal experiences. This scenario also raises concerns regarding countertransference. The counselor's own history with addiction could influence his clinical judgment or emotional responses during counseling sessions. From a clinical perspective, the counselor must consider whether disclosure strengthens the therapeutic alliance or creates dependency over identification within the counseling relationship. Overall, this situation involves ethical, clinical, and professional concerns that require thoughtful ethical decision making. There are several ACA ethical standards that apply to this scenario. The first is the ACA Standard A1A, which states that counselors' primary responsibility is promoting the welfare of the client. This standard is important because the counselor must evaluate whether self-disclosure truly benefits the client or whether it mainly satisfies the counselor's desire to connect. Another relevant standard is A4B regarding personal values. This standard reminds counselors to remain aware of their own beliefs, values, and experiences so they do not unintentionally impose them onto clients. In this case, the client's recovery experience could influence how the client understands addiction and treatment. Even if the counselor has good intentions, personal experiences can shape the counseling process. ACA Standard A5D also applies because it discusses potentially beneficial interactions, including self-disclosure. The ACA Code of Ethics allows self-disclosure when it is clinically appropriate and intended to benefit the client. Virginia Board of Counseling regulations emphasize protecting client welfare and maintaining professionalism. Counselors are expected to avoid actions that could exploit or harm clients. Although HIPAA does not directly address self-disclosure, it does reinforce the importance of professionalism, ethical conduct, and protecting the integrity of the therapeutic relationship. These ethical standards demonstrate that counselors must carefully evaluate both the risks and benefits of self-disclosure before acting. There are several important moral principles involved in this ethical dilemma. The first is beneficence, which refers to promoting the well-being of the client. The counselor may believe that the self-disclosure could help the client feel understood and supported, which could strengthen the therapeutic alliance. Another important principle is non-maleficence, which means avoiding harm. Even though disclosure may have benefits, it also carries risks. The counselors must consider whether disclosure could unintentionally damage professional boundaries or negatively affect treatment. Autonomy is also relevant because the client should be allowed to form independent views regarding addiction and recovery. If the counselor shares too much personal information, the client may begin viewing the counselor's recovery experience as the correct approach instead of developing their own path. Fidelity is another key principle because it involves trust, honesty, and maintaining professionalism within the counseling relationship. Since the client already struggles with trusting counselors, maintaining fidelity is especially important in this situation. Scholarly research suggests that self-disclosure can strengthen therapeutic relationships when it is intentional, limited, and focused on client benefit. However, research also warns that inappropriate disclosure can blur professional boundaries. Consultation is also essential in ethical decision-making. Seeking supervision from experienced counselors allows the counselor to gain objective feedback and ensure ethical standards are being followed. And just for reference, because I want to make sure those are included, the references I used on this page are Zer et al. 2021, Levitt and Hartwig, Moorhead, 2022. There are several possible courses of action the counselor could take in this situation. The first option would be to fully disclose his recovery experience to the client. This may strengthen rapport and help the client feel understood. However, it also increases the risk of blurred boundaries and shifting focus away from the client, Zerd et al. 2021. The second option would be avoiding self-disclosure completely and redirecting the conversation back to the client. This maintains professional, clear boundaries and reduces ethical risk. However, it may also limit the opportunity to build trust and connection with the client. The third option would be limited intentional self-disclosure. This would involve briefly acknowledging an understanding or experience without discussing detailed personal information. This approach allows the counselor to maintain professionalism while still validating the client's concerns. Levitt and Hartwig, Moorhead, 2022. The final option would be seeking supervision before responding to the client. Consulting with a supervisor allows for additional ethical guidance and supports responsible clinical decision making. Each of these options carries potential benefits and risks that must be carefully evaluated. Each possible course of action has different consequences for the client, counselor, and therapeutic relationship. If the counselor fully discloses his recovery experience, the client may initially feel more understood and connected, but this approach blurs those professional boundaries and shifts attention away from the client's treatment needs. If the counselor completely avoids disclosure, professional boundaries remain very clear, but the client may continue struggling with trust and may feel emotionally disconnected from the counselor. Limited intentional disclosure provides a balanced approach. It allows for the counselor to validate the client's concerns while still maintaining professional boundaries and keeping the focus on the client. Seeking supervision also has important benefits because it supports the ethical accountability and reduces the likelihood of emotionally driven decisions. When evaluating consequences, counselors must consider both short-term and long-term effects on treatment boundaries, and client welfare. After evaluating the possible options, I believe the most ethical course of action would be limited intentional self-disclosure combined with supervision. This approach allows the counselor to briefly acknowledge understanding and support the client's emotional needs without providing unnecessary personal details. The disclosure should remain brief, purposeful, and directly connected to the client's treatment goals. The counselor should avoid discussing detailed recovery experiences that may shift the focus away from the client. I also believe supervision is extremely important in this situation because it provides accountability and professional guidance. Ethical decision making should not occur in isolation. This approach best aligns with the ACA Code of Ethics because it balances beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and fidelity while prioritizing client welfare. ACA 2014. Overall, limited intentional disclosure provides the best balance between empathy, rapport, professionalism, and ethical responsibility. The selected course of action must also be evaluated using the three ethical tests: justice, publicity, and universality. The justice test allows whether the decision treats the client fairly and ethically. In this situation, limited disclosure remains fair because it focuses on the client's needs rather than the counselor's personal needs. The publicity test asks whether the counselor should feel comfortable if the decision were reviewed publicly by supervisors, colleagues, or a licensing board. Since the disclosure is limited, intentional, and clinically appropriate, it would likely withstand professional review. The universality test asks whether it would be acceptable if other counselors acted similarly in comparable situations. Limited intentional disclosure with supervision could reasonably serve as an ethical model for other professionals. After applying these ethical tests, I do not believe any major ethical dilemmas remain. The selected action continues to prioritize professionalism, client welfare, and ethical practice. The first implementation step would be reflecting carefully before responding to the client's question. The counselor should evaluate personal motivations and ensure the response is clinically appropriate. The second step would be consulting with a supervisor or experienced colleague for additional ethical guidance, or et al. 2021. If disclosure is determined to be appropriate, the counselor should use only brief and intentional disclosure while avoiding unnecessary personal details. After responding, the counselor should redirect the focus back to the client and continue exploring the client's experiences, emotions, and treatment goals. The counselor should also document the ethical reasoning behind the decision and note how the disclosure was intended to benefit the client therapeutically. Throughout future sessions, the counselor should continue monitoring the therapeutic relationship and reassessing boundaries if necessary. Ethical decision making is not a one-time event. Levitt and Hartwig Moorhead, 2022. It requires ongoing reflection, consultation, and accountability throughout the counseling relationship. In conclusion, this case demonstrates how complex ethical decision making can become within the counseling relationship. Counselors must carefully balance empathy, authenticity, professionalism, and ethical responsibility when considering self-disclosure. Although self-disclosure can strengthen rapport and trust, it should always remain intentional, limited, and focused on client benefit rather than counselor needs. ACA 2014. The ACA ethical decision-making model provides a structured process for evaluating difficult situations and making sure client welfare is indeed protected. This scenario reinforces the importance of consultation, professional boundaries, and ongoing ethical reflection within counseling practice. Ultimately, maintaining client-centered care and ethical professionalism remains the counselor's highest responsibility. I now have my references listed, and those are also listed throughout my PowerPoint slides. And I do want to apologize for the issue with being able to view the video. I hope that we're able to view it this time, and I did decide to just go ahead and re-record it because of all of the technical issues. I wanted to make sure I was able to upload it correctly. So thank you for your patience. I will make sure this gets to you, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Thanks.